Hey, what's up, my people? John Middlekauff, new YouTube channel. What I need you to do, subscribe, like the video, leave a comment, share with your friends. Appreciate everyone that has. It's the podcast, 3 and Out. You can listen wherever you listen to podcasts. Apple, Spotify. We got you covered. Also, thevolume.com. We got merch right here. FlexFit hat. Go to thevolume.com. Get yourself a 3 and Out hat. Most football coaches have similar mindsets when it comes to philosophical beliefs in the sport, right? It's a violent game, so you're going to want violent players. You're going to want big physical guys that hit really hard, right? You're going to want offensive linemen who are tough as nails. You're going to want players to battle injuries and play when they're dinged up. This isn't peewee football. This isn't high school football. You're paid a premium to play football. And coaches and executives expect that, and owners, right? It's part of the reason you get paid is to play through, bumps and bruises. It's all great players do. Every guy in the NFL playing this upcoming weekend and just played last weekend is not 100%. A lot of guys are closer to 50% than they are 75%. But a lot of coaches, especially the younger generation, Kyle Shanahan or Sean McVay, Brandon Staley was really good at this. They talk about football not under those terms. They actually talk about football much more like a dude in the media who has multiple degrees would tweet about football. And they get a lot of praise that way, right? Brandon Staley used to speak early on. He called every reporter by their name and spoke because he's intellectual. He's a smart guy, could hold a conversation that felt like he was one of the presses or the media. And the media, let's face it, looks down on people who they feel are intellectually inferior, right? They value academics and academia as a whole, I would say, more than most of us, let's say, in the business world, where we value much more about production, revenue, less about, no one cares where you went to school if you produce. I knew a lot of guys that didn't graduate high school that were multimillionaires growing up. Friends, grandparents, or even parents. Now, it's different generation in 2024. That's probably less likely. But your education level in the real world, I got news for you. When it comes to success, not that a college education, I have multiple degrees, but it does not determine your success or failure. Now, there are stats saying you're better off, obviously, going to college than not. But just because you don't does not mean you're guaranteed to not make it in life. That's not how it works. And the entire media is well educated and they take academics really seriously. And Dan Campbell felt like the opposite of academics. He talked about fighting and biting and doing whatever it took to win. He gave off, quote unquote, a meathead theme. Even though a lot of people in the sport of football, I would say, have some meathead qualities. Right? To love football as much as you do in the NFL or Power 5 as a coach, you have to have some meathead tendencies, right? It's impossible. I didn't love football as much as all the guys I was around. I saw it firsthand, like Andy Reid, Sean McDermott, Matt Nagy, Brett Veach, Howie Roseman, like deep to their core, they just like football more than I do. And I love football. I love football probably more than 95% of people listening to this. But at the highest level of the sport, like every guy's a little bit of a meathead, right? That's why we like the sport. But the way you communicate it, like this is why Belichick always kind of drove guys crazy. He treats the press like shit, but everyone acknowledges he's very, very intelligent and he's an academic. So people kind of battle. They just call him an asshole, but no one ever questions his intelligence. People acted like Dan Campbell was a village idiot, was a complete moron, right? And I think he's a great example of early on, he didn't talk like some of these younger hotshots. Obviously, he didn't look like them either. He's enormous, and he looks like he could still play in the NFL as being a former player. But I think he's a good example of clearly kind of knows what he's doing. And clearly he relates very, very well with players. The other thing is not everyone is going to have the capability of being Sean McVay or Kyle Shanahan or Matt LaFleur as a play caller, right? Jim Harbaugh cannot call plays. He's a former NFL quarterback. He cannot call offensive plays. Never does it. But you know what Jim does exceptionally well? Hire coaches. And that is a skill that, I'm sorry, is kind of important, right? Mike Tomlin, why did he hit some kind of rough waters? Hired the wrong coach. Why is John Harbaugh running circles around everyone when Lamar's on the field? Because he has pretty good coaching staff. So Dan Campbell, like, do you get credit for, I don't know, elevating Ben Johnson and making him your offensive coordinator? Bringing Aaron Glenn to coach your defense? I mean, both these guys could become head coaches. And this notion that, like, is Dan Campbell the next Nick Sirianni? Here would be my pushback on that. Nick Sirianni's guy is Frank Reich, who, listen, former quarterback, I think got extra credit because he's 6'4", looks the part, and played the position. I don't think he's any good. I do not. If I'm playing Frank, I'm sending the limo to make sure he's on the sideline and not a minute late. I do not want him to miss one snap of the game. Dan Campbell's supporters happen to be Bill Parcells, widely regarded as one of the greatest coaches in the history of the league, and Sean Payton, who resurrected a dog shit franchise in New Orleans and then was just given $90 million for the Denver Broncos. And listen, we can debate how good he is or not. He's pretty damn good. Those are the two guys that he comes from. So I think the media missed because he didn't talk and look like them. And let's face it, a lot of guys in the NFL nowadays definitely talk like them. And it buys you a pass. Now, they turn on you immediately when you start losing. But Dan Campbell talked like a position coach. He talked about drinking 60 ounces of coffee before 8 a.m. He talked about scratching and clawing and doing whatever you had to do to kill the opponent. That's how football coaches talk behind closed doors, whether you're Belichick, whether you're Andy, or whether you're Dan Campbell. That's the sport. That's the way you communicate with your players. Now, the way you do it publicly, and a lot of people, that cover the sport, I think are just obsessed in general with optics. I've always said optics are the biggest BS thing going in society. It's just about what's actually going on. I'm a big fan of reality. Well, what's actually happening? What's actually going on behind closed doors? What's the reality of the situation? And the reality of football is always going to be, it's a tough man's game. Even in a sport that has tried to regulate violence out of it, and relative to what it was when I was a kid in the early and mid 90s, is clearly a lot different. It's still a very violent game. It's still a game where people tackle each other at high rates of speed. Guys that do not have much fat on them and have a lot of muscle and a lot of power. It always will be a violent game, no matter what. No matter if you want to tell me that a guy's a defenseless receiver. There is no such thing. When you're running a route, there are defenders that are going to tackle you if you get the ball. And you know that when the ball is snapped. So I think Dan Campbell is just a good example of who gives a shit how he talks. Are you just good at your job? I mean, there are a lot of people that their resume, they should be successful in their failures. There are a lot of educated derelicts all over America. Just like there are a lot of people whose resume from an education standpoint or the way they communicate, it's like, how's this guy successful? And they're making millions and they're crushing it in their industry. And props to Dan Campbell for going to a franchise that was trash. I mean, an embarrassment, and having them in the conference championship game. That's an incredible accomplishment.